The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the near-empty police station. Officer James Carter leaned back in his chair, staring at the old photograph on his desk. His daughter, Emily, smiled back at him, her eyes filled with the innocent light he hadn't seen in years. The anniversary of her disappearance always brought the same heaviness to his chest, a weight he could never shake. "Carter," a voice broke through his thoughts. Officer Lily Monroe, the department's newest recruit, stood in the doorway, her crisp uniform practically gleaming. "We got a call. Something about lights in the forest." Carter's jaw tightened. The forest. His gut churned at the mention. That place had a dark history. People who ventured too far often didn't return. He glanced at the clock. Midnight. Of course. It would be midnight. "Lights," Carter repeated, rising slowly. He grabbed his jacket, slipping the picture into his pocket. "What kind of lights?" Monroe shrugged, trying to mask her excitement. Dispatch said flickering lights and some weird noises. "Locals think it's just kids pulling pranks again." Carter wasn't convinced. "And you're so eager to check it out." Monroe smirked. "Well, someone's got to watch your back." Her attempt at humor did little to lighten Carter's mood. Together, they walked out into the cold night, the station's door creaking shut behind them. The town lay in silence, blanketed in fog that grew denser as they approached the forest's edge. Carter halted, scanning the treeline. The place seemed alive, as if the shadows themselves were watching. His radio crackled, and a distorted voice emerged. "Help, they're leading us." "Don't follow the light." Carter exchanged a wary glance with Monroe. "Stay close," he muttered, stepping into the forest's embrace. The air grew colder, and the dense fog swallowed their flashlights. Somewhere in the distance, faint, flickering lights began to glow. The forest swallowed them whole. Towering trees stood like sentinels, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The dense fog twisted between the trunks, muting every sound except the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The further they ventured, the more oppressive the air became, as though the forest itself resisted their presence. Carter looked. Monroe pointed to the ground. A torn piece of fabric clung to a bush, fluttering in the slight breeze. Nearby, an old, rusted canteen lay half buried in the dirt. Carter crouched, inspecting it. The initials EH were etched faintly on the side. "This looks old," Monroe said, kneeling beside him. "Maybe from one of those hikers who went missing." Carter nodded grimly, standing as he scanned the area. His grip on his flashlight tightened. The forest was littered with stories, campers and hikers who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers of their last moments. A sudden sound pierced the silence. A faint hum. It was low and rhythmic, almost like singing. Monroe froze. "Do you hear that?" Carter didn't respond, his eyes narrowing as he tried to pinpoint the source. Then he saw it, a faint light flickering in the distance. It swayed gently, bobbing up and down as if carried by an invisible hand. "Stay close," Carter warned, leading Monroe toward the light. As they moved deeper, the trees grew thicker, their twisted trunks forming grotesque shapes in the dim glow. The hum grew louder, more distinct, and the light brighter. It wasn't a fire or a lantern. It was something unnatural, its glow cold and unearthly. Then they saw him. A tall, shadowy figure stood motionless, holding a lantern that pulsed with an eerie, flickering light. His face was obscured by the darkness, but his presence was undeniable. Monroe took a step forward, her expression vacant, her hand reaching out. "Monroe!" Carter barked, grabbing her arm. She blinked, shaking her head as though snapping out of a trance. The lantern man stood still, his lantern casting long, grotesque shadows that seemed to writhe around him. Then, without a sound, he turned and began to walk deeper into the forest, the light fading into the mist. "Do we follow him?" Monroe whispered. Carter's jaw clenched. "We don't have a choice." The hum grew louder as they pursued the lantern man. His light bobbed ahead, always just out of reach. Carter and Monroe pushed forward, the forest seeming to close in around them. The fog thickened, and the trees twisted into unnatural shapes. They emerged into a wide clearing, encircled by skeletal, lifeless trees. In the center stood the Lantern Man, his lantern raised high. The glow illuminated the clearing, casting long, warped shadows that danced like living things. Carter felt his chest tighten. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Monroe's breathing quickened beside him, and then they appeared. From the shadows, figures began to emerge. They moved silently, their forms pale and translucent, their faces empty and lifeless. One by one, they stepped forward, surrounding the clearing. Carter's eyes scanned the ghostly crowd, his heart pounding. Then he saw her. Emily, his daughter, stood among the figures, her once bright eyes now dull and void. Carter's breath caught in his throat. "Emily," he whispered, stepping forward. Monroe grabbed his arm. "Carter, wait. Something's not right. I have to get her," Carter said, his voice cracking. The Lantern Man remained motionless, his empty gaze fixed on Carter. The humming grew deafening, a chorus of voices crying out in despair. Monroe staggered, clutching her head. Carter's mind raced. He had spent years searching for his daughter, and now she was here, right in front of him. But something deep inside him screamed that this wasn't her. The Lantern Man's lantern flared, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. Emily's figure stretched out a hand, her face emotionless. "She's not real," Monroe muttered, her voice strained. "They're all trapped." Carter clenched his fists. He knew Monroe was right, but it didn't make the decision any easier. His gaze locked onto the Lantern Man, the source of it all. The light, the hum, the figures, they were all bound to that lantern. "I'm sorry, Emily," Carter whispered. He lunged forward, grabbing his baton. With all his strength, he swung it at the lantern. The moment it shattered, the clearing exploded in light. A brilliant white light erupted from the shattered lantern, blinding Carter and Monroe. The deafening hum rose to a fever pitch, transforming into agonized screams. Carter shielded his eyes, feeling a wave of heat wash over him as the Lantern Man's figure began to disintegrate. The ghostly figures writhed and twisted, their translucent forms flickering like dying flames. Emily's figure turned to Carter, her eyes briefly meeting his. For a fleeting moment, recognition sparked in her gaze. "Dad," she whispered, her voice faint, almost lost in the chaos. And then she was gone, dissolving into the light along with the others. "No," Carter shouted, reaching out. But it was too late. The light dimmed, leaving behind only silence and darkness. The Lantern Man's ashes scattered on the wind, his presence seemingly erased. Carter stood frozen, his heart heavy with grief and regret. The forest around them seemed to sigh, as if relieved of its torment. Monroe, still clutching her head, stumbled to Carter's side. "Is it over?" she asked, her voice trembling. Carter didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the spot where Emily had stood. The weight of her final word, "Dad," pressed heavily on him. The forest began to shift. The oppressive fog lifted slightly, and the trees seemed less menacing. But Carter knew this wasn't a true victory. The Lantern Man was gone. But at what cost? "We need to go," Carter said finally, his voice hoarse. Monroe nodded, her face pale. Together, they retraced their steps, the forest gradually releasing its grip. As they neared the edge, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. They stepped out into the open, leaving the haunted woods behind. But the silence was heavy, and Carter knew the horrors they'd faced would follow them. Back at the station, Carter sat alone in the dimly lit office, his hands wrapped around a lukewarm cup of coffee. The events of the night replayed in his mind. The Lantern Man, the ghostly figures, and Emily's final, fleeting words. Monroe had handed in her resignation earlier that morning. "I can't do this anymore," she had said, her eyes haunted. Carter couldn't blame her. The forest had taken its toll on both of them. But Carter couldn't walk away. Not yet. His mind was plagued by the vision of Emily and the lingering feeling that the Lantern Man's power wasn't truly gone. The phone on his desk buzzed, breaking the heavy silence. Carter hesitated before answering. "Carter," he said, his voice flat. "Officer Carter." The voice on the other end said, strained and nervous. "We've got a situation. A town about 50 miles from here. Residents are reporting strange lights in the woods. They're describing a man carrying a lantern." Carter's stomach dropped. He hung up the phone and grabbed his jacket, his resolve hardening. The fight wasn't over. As he stepped into the morning light, the weight of his mission settled heavily on his shoulders. The lantern man had returned, and this time, Carter would be ready. The police station was quiet, save for the low hum of old fluorescent lights. Officer Rachel Dawson sat alone at her desk, sifting through a pile of cold case files. The one on top had become a ritual of sorts, the unsolved disappearance of her younger brother, Mark. 10 years, and the question still haunted her. Where did he go? Why hadn't they found him? The station's clock ticked softly, marking the late hour. Most officers had gone home, leaving Dawson with only the distant murmur of a police radio for company. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, when the phone on her desk suddenly rang, cutting through the stillness. She hesitated. It was unusual for the station's landline to ring at this hour. Reaching for the receiver, she answered, her voice steady. "Officer Dawson." A crackle of static filled the line, followed by a faint, trembling voice. "Rachel, it's me. Mark." Dawson's heart stopped. The voice was unmistakable. Older, but undeniably her brother's. "Mark," she whispered, gripping the phone tightly. "Where are you? What's going on? Help me," the voice pleaded, breaking into static. "I'm trapped. It's so dark. Please, Rachel, find me." "Mark, wait." The line went dead, leaving Dawson in stunned silence. For a moment, she sat frozen, the weight of the impossible sinking in. Then she sprang into action, tracing the call through the station system. The results sent a shiver down her spine. The call had come from an abandoned house on the outskirts of town, a house long rumored to be cursed. Dawson grabbed her jacket and radioed Detective Sam Harper. "I need backup," she said, her voice firm. "Meet me at the old Briarwood house." "Rachel, it's nearly midnight. What's going on?" Harper asked. "I'll explain on the way," she replied, already heading for the door. The station lights flickered as she left, the phone on her desk ringing once more in the empty room. The old Briarwood house stood like a decaying sentinel at the edge of town. Its windows were shattered, and the front porch sagged under years of neglect. The surrounding trees cast long shadows under the moonlight, their twisted branches clawing at the sky. Harper pulled his car up beside Dawson's, his expression skeptical as he stepped out. "This place?" he asked, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "It's been empty for decades." Dawson didn't respond, her focus on the house. She tightened her grip on her flashlight and motioned toward the door. "The call came from here. Let's go." Harper sighed but followed. The door groaned as Dawson pushed it open, revealing an interior swallowed by dust and decay. The air was heavy, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something more metallic, like old blood. As they moved deeper inside, Dawson's flashlight beam landed on a small pile of objects on the living room floor. Her heart skipped a beat. It was Mark's old belongings, his backpack, a worn baseball cap, and a photo of the two of them as children. "What the hell?" Harper muttered, picking up the photo. "How did this get here?" Before Dawson could answer, a faint noise echoed from upstairs. It was a rhythmic tapping, like fingernails drumming against wood. Dawson's instincts kicked in. She motioned for Harper to follow as they ascended the creaking staircase. On the second floor, they found a room with cryptic messages scrawled on the walls. "Help me and stay away," written in what appeared to be ash. But the most chilling discovery sat in the center of the room. A dusty rotary phone resting on a small table, its cord frayed and dangling. "That thing's not connected to anything," Harper said, frowning. The phone suddenly rang, its shrill tone cutting through the silence. Dawson froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she reached out and picked up the receiver. "Rachel." The voice on the other end was unmistakable. "I'm so close. Don't leave me." The line went dead again, and the room fell silent. Harper stared at her, his disbelief slowly giving way to concern. "We're not alone here," he said quietly. Dawson nodded. "Let's keep moving." The drive back to town was eerily quiet. Harper stole glances at Dawson, whose knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel. The voice still echoed in her head, each word from Mark pulling her deeper into the past. At the station, Dawson sat at her desk, her mind racing. She barely noticed when her personal cell phone buzzed on the table. Without thinking, she answered. "Rachel, don't stop looking," Mark's voice pleaded, barely above a whisper. Dawson's breath hitched. "Mark, where are you? How are you calling me?" Static crackled, and then the line went dead. She stared at the phone, her hands trembling. This wasn't just some prank. Mark was reaching out from beyond. Over the next few days, the calls intensified. Each time, Mark's voice grew more frantic, warning her that time was running out. But it wasn't just the calls. Strange occurrences began to plague Dawson's life. Lights in the station flickered violently whenever she walked by. Her office door would creak open on its own, revealing empty hallways. At home, things worsened. Picture frames fell from shelves, and her radio turned on by itself, playing distorted music. One night, she woke to the sound of heavy breathing, only to find her bedroom empty. Harper, initially skeptical, experienced his own encounter. While reviewing the Briarwood case files late one night, he heard faint whispers emanating from the station's break room. When he went to investigate, he found nothing, except for a single word scrawled on the window in condensation: "Run." Shaken, Harper joined Dawson in her obsession. They pored over old town records, uncovering a chilling history. Briarwood had once been the home of an eccentric recluse who dabbled in occult rituals, trying to communicate with the dead. The rotary phone they found was central to his experiments. "We need to go back," Dawson said, her voice firm. Harper hesitated but nodded. "If this thing is using Mark, we have to stop it." That night, armed with their findings, they returned to the Briarwood house. Dawson's determination burned brighter than her fear. She could feel it. Mark was close, but so was something far more sinister. The house seemed different this time, as if it was waiting for them. The air was colder, heavier, and every creak of the floorboards echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Dawson led the way, her flashlight barely penetrating the oppressive darkness. They made their way to the hidden basement Harper had uncovered during their research. The door was concealed behind a rotting bookshelf, its handle rusted and cold to the touch. Dawson hesitated before pulling it open. The basement was a shrine to darkness. Candles, long extinguished, lined the walls, their wax pooled on the floor. At the center stood a stone pedestal, and on it sat the rotary phone. It looked untouched, but the air around it buzzed with energy. Mark's voice broke the silence, soft and pleading. "Rachel, you're so close. Please help me." Dawson's chest tightened. She stepped forward, but Harper grabbed her arm. "This isn't right. Look around. This thing, whatever it is, has been feeding off of you." Dawson shook her head, her eyes fixed on the phone. "I can't just leave him." The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to deepen. Slowly, the entity revealed itself, a towering, shadowy figure with hollow eyes that seemed to suck in the light. Its form flickered, shifting between solid and spectral. The voice of Mark twisted into a distorted growl. "This thing is using him," Harper said, his voice trembling. "You have to end it." Dawson's hands shook as she approached the phone. Mark's voice called out again, desperate and clear. "Rachel, please don't let me go." Tears streamed down her face as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mark." With a final burst of resolve, she grabbed the phone and smashed it against the pedestal. The entity let out a piercing scream as the basement erupted in chaos. The walls cracked, and the ground shook violently. Harper pulled Dawson toward the stairs as the house began to collapse. The house crumbled into rubble as Dawson and Harper stumbled out into the cold night. Dust and debris filled the air, and for a moment, all was silent. The oppressive energy that had haunted the Briarwood house seemed to lift. Dawson collapsed onto the ground, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Harper knelt beside her, his face a mix of relief and concern. "It's over," he said softly. But Dawson wasn't so sure. The weight of her decision bore down on her. She had destroyed the phone, severing the entity's hold. But at what cost? Mark's voice was gone, and with it, the last piece of him she had left. Back at the station, the mood was somber. Harper filed a report, though neither of them could fully explain what had happened. Dawson sat at her desk, staring at her phone. The calls had stopped, and the station felt emptier than ever. As she prepared to leave, her phone buzzed. The screen lit up with an unknown number. Her pulse quickened as she hesitated, then answered. "Rachel," the voice was faint but unmistakable. "I'm still here." The line went dead, leaving Dawson staring into the darkness, her heart pounding. She knew the truth. The fight wasn't over, and the next call could come at any time. The town of Red Hollow rested under a serene twilight, its streets empty and quiet. Detective Eric Hayes leaned back in his chair at the police station, the faint hum of a ceiling fan blending with the distant murmur of passing cars. It was the kind of stillness he'd grown accustomed to in this sleepy town, until Officer Mia Reynolds rushed in, her face pale and tense. "Detective, we've got something strange," she said, holding a notepad. Multiple calls about voices coming from the old tunnel entrances. Hayes frowned, straightening. "Voices? From where exactly?" "Manholes, storm drains, the old mining tunnels on the east side. People are hearing whispers. Some even claim the voices are calling their names," Reynolds explained, her blue eyes filled with concern. "Probably some kids messing around," Hayes said, but Reynolds shook her head. "I thought so too. But it's happening in different parts of town, and one caller said they heard a voice that sounded like their missing brother." That caught Hayes' attention. The disappearances in Red Hollow were an unresolved thorn in his side. Over the years, people had vanished without a trace, often near the abandoned tunnels, but nothing had ever come of the investigations. Hayes stood and grabbed his coat. "Let's check it out." Reynolds nodded, relief flashing across her face. They drove in silence to the eastern edge of town, where the entrance to one of the old tunnels gaped like a mouth in the hillside. Hayes stepped out of the car, the cool evening air heavy with the scent of damp earth. As they approached the entrance, a faint whisper echoed from below, chilling and unmistakable. It wasn't the wind. "Did you hear that?" Reynolds asked, her voice barely a whisper. Hayes nodded, his jaw tightening. "Let's go." The tunnel swallowed them in darkness. The thin beams of their flashlights barely cut through the thick, stale air, illuminating crumbling walls and rusted support beams. The echoes of their footsteps bounced back at them, distorted and strange. Reynolds kept close behind Hayes, her breathing steady but shallow. "These tunnels run for miles, right?" she asked, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might wake something. "Yeah," Hayes replied. "They were part of the old mining system, closed down after the last collapse in the 70s. The further they went, the more the air seemed to thicken. The faint sound of dripping water echoed somewhere in the distance. Then they saw it, an old child's backpack, half covered in dust and dirt. Reynolds crouched to pick it up, her gloved hand brushing off grime to reveal a name tag, Liam R. "He disappeared 2 years ago," she said softly, her throat tightening. "Right near here." Hayes nodded grimly. "Looks like someone's been down here recently." They continued forward, the tunnel walls narrowing slightly. As they walked, strange carvings began to appear on the walls, crude symbols and jagged lines that seemed to tell an unintelligible story. Reynolds ran her fingers over one of the symbols, a shiver running down her spine. Suddenly, the whispers returned, faint but distinct. This time, they were closer. Hayes stopped, his flashlight shaking slightly as he scanned the tunnel. "Eric." He stiffened. It was a woman's voice, soft and familiar. He turned toward the sound, but there was nothing there. "Reynolds, did you hear that?" he asked, his voice tense. Reynolds nodded, her face pale. "It sounded like my dad." The whispers grew louder, echoing from every direction. Hayes clenched his jaw. "We need to keep moving." As they pressed deeper into the tunnels, the voices grew clearer, calling their names with increasing desperation. The walls seemed to close in, and the path ahead twisted and turned in unnatural ways. "Stay close," Hayes muttered, gripping his flashlight tighter. But the unease in his gut told him that something, or someone, was already too close. The tunnel twisted unpredictably, each turn leading them deeper into the suffocating darkness. Hayes stopped occasionally to mark their path with chalk, but the shifting walls made it hard to tell if they were retracing their steps or forging ahead. "We're not alone," Reynolds murmured, her eyes darting toward the shadows. The whispers ebbed and flowed, sometimes distant, other times disturbingly close. They stumbled upon an alcove where the air was colder. In the middle of the small space stood a makeshift shrine. There were candles melted to the ground, their wax hardened into strange shapes. At the center, a photograph of a family, 2 parents and a young boy, lay framed in cracked glass. "Whoever was down here believed in something," Hayes muttered, picking up the photo. His mind raced, trying to piece together how this fit with the missing persons cases. He passed it to Reynolds, who barely glanced at it before freezing. "Detective," she whispered, her flashlight pointing to a section of the wall. The carvings here were more intricate, forming a crude map of the tunnels. At its center was a chamber, marked by a spiral symbol that seemed to pulse under their flashlight beams. "That must be where the voices are strongest," Reynolds said. Hayes hesitated. "If we head there, there might not be a way back." "I'm not leaving until we find out what happened," Reynolds said firmly, her gaze unwavering. They pressed on, following the map's directions. The whispers became clearer, forming sentences now. Hayes heard fragments of familiar voices, including those of victims he'd investigated over the years. Their pleas ranged from desperate to chillingly calm. "Eric, you could have saved me," one voice said, echoing in his head. Reynolds clenched her fists as a voice she hadn't heard in years called her name. "Mia, it's your dad. I'm here." The tunnel opened into a massive chamber. At its center, a chasm yawned wide, its depths glowing faintly with an unnatural, pulsating light. The voices emanated from the rift, louder and more desperate. "This is it," Hayes said, his voice barely audible. The heart of the labyrinth. The cavern pulsed with life, its walls vibrating softly, as if the earth itself was breathing. The rift in the center exuded a cold, bluish glow, illuminating symbols etched deep into the surrounding rock. The whispers here were overwhelming, a cacophony of voices blending into an otherworldly chorus. Reynolds stepped closer, drawn to the edge of the rift. "Dad," she murmured, her eyes locked on the glowing chasm. Hayes grabbed her arm. "Reynolds, don't." But before he could pull her back, a shadow began to rise from the rift. The shape was massive and amorphous, its edges flickering like smoke. 2 hollow eyes, voids of pure darkness, fixed on them, and the voices shifted in tone, turning from pleas to warnings. "Leave this place," the voices hissed in unison. Hayes instinctively pulled his gun, but he knew it would be useless. "We have to seal this thing," he said, scanning the room. His flashlight landed on a rusted box near the far wall. Inside were old mining explosives, covered in dust but still intact. "These might work," Hayes said, grabbing the box. The entity loomed closer, its hollow eyes narrowing. The temperature dropped further, and the air grew thick, making it hard to breathe. The ground trembled as the entity reached out with shadowy tendrils, brushing against the walls and ceiling. "Set them by the rift," Reynolds said, her voice steady despite the terror in her eyes. Working quickly, Hayes placed the explosives around the rift's edge. Reynolds fumbled with the detonator, her hand shaking. "Hurry!" The entity let out a guttural roar, and the ground beneath them cracked. Hayes grabbed Reynolds and pulled her toward the tunnel entrance as she hit the detonator. A deafening explosion ripped through the cavern, collapsing the rift and sending a shockwave that threw them to the ground. The entity let out a final, bone-chilling scream before being consumed by the collapsing earth. Dust and debris filled the air as the tunnel shook violently. Hayes and Reynolds scrambled to their feet, coughing as they stumbled toward the exit. The walls groaned, large chunks of rock falling behind them. "Go, go, go!" Hayes shouted, adrenaline pushing him forward. They burst out into the cool night air, just as the tunnel entrance collapsed behind them, sealing the labyrinth below. For a moment, all was silent except for their ragged breathing. Reynolds leaned against a tree, her hands on her knees. "It's over," she said, though her voice carried little relief. Hayes nodded, but his expression was grim. He couldn't shake the image of the entity's hollow eyes or the whispers that still echoed faintly in his mind. "For now," he muttered. They returned to the station, battered and shaken. As the hours passed, Hayes filed a report, leaving out the supernatural details. Reynolds sat silently at her desk, staring at nothing. The weight of what they'd faced, and what they'd lost, hung heavy in the room. Just as Hayes was about to head home, he paused by the front door. A faint sound caught his attention. He turned toward a nearby storm drain. A whisper floated up from the darkness. "Detective, help me." Hayes stood frozen, his hand tightening around his flashlight. The fight wasn't over.